Hello, and welcome to the first of our wellness webinar series, Sleep and Brain Injury, offered by the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators. I am Gabriela Lawrence Soto, NASHIA's Training and Education Committee Chair, and Maria Crowley, NASHIA's Professional Development Director, is our webinar organizer. Thank you for joining us. If you are unfamiliar with NASHIA, we are a nonprofit organization created to assist state government in promoting partnerships and building systems to meet the needs of individuals with brain injury and their families. A GoToWebinar user guide is available for download from the NASHIA website. This is a great resource for making the most out of your live webinar experience. Handouts of today's presentation are available for download. For that, check your attendee control panel for the handouts pane. To ask questions during the webinar, please enter it in the questions pane on your control panel, and our organizer will forward your question to our speaker after the presentation. If we run out of time, the presenter will respond to your questions via email. Continuing education credits for social work and certified rehabilitation counseling, as well as general certificates of attendance, are available for today's event. At the end of the webinar, you will receive an email with an evaluation and instructions on obtaining credits. The webinar will also be archived for later access on your website, on our website. Again, today's slides are in the documents pane for you to download. I am so excited to introduce to you our presenter, Dr. Kim Gorgens, who is a professor at the University of Denver. She is an expert in assessment and management of healthy, aging, and injured brains. And she oversees a large portfolio of traumatic brain injury research. She has lectured extensively on brain injury, including her 2010 TED Talk on youth sports concussions and a 2018 TED Talk on brain injuries in criminal justice. Her work has been featured in US News, Newsweek, Salon.com, and more. She is a board-certified rehabilitation psychology and is the vice president of the American Board of Rehabilitation Psychology. Welcome, Dr. Gorgens.
Yay, Gabby, thank you so much for that introduction. And can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, yes. Perfect. I joke that every time I have someone read that introduction that I wish that I captured it on film for my mom, because she'd be the only one who actually believes that that stuff is true. It is true, but she would get such a kick out of it and would share it with her bridge group. So thank you, NASHIA, for having me and for the invite, and especially for the invitation to talk about sleep. This is my very favorite thing to talk about. I teach in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver, and I tell my students, I lecture a lot about sleep, and I tell my students that sleep is actually the common denominator of everything we study. So mental illness, disease, recovery from injury. So sleep is where it's at, and I'm really excited to have everybody join today to talk about that. For some of you who I've had the chance and the luxury to meet before, you know me and you know that I overdo everything. So I've included way too much information, and a little bit of it is a bit weedy, but if you can trust me and hang in there, I promise that we'll circle back and make all of the really weedy information seem more salient, and you'll better understand the kinds of interventions we talk about post-TBI. First, we'll better understand the effects of sleep post-TBI, and then you can better understand the effect of the interventions once you understand something about the mechanics and the architecture of sleep. So welcome and thank you for hanging in. I'm going to talk as quickly as possible, not only because I'm an East Coaster, but also because I've overfilled the slides and I would love to have a few minutes to answer Q&A. Like Gabby said, I'm also totally happy to serve as a resource for anyone with questions. I've included everywhere possible references, so you can also get in touch with the authors of those papers. I have found that to a person, everyone is really excited to talk about their research. So if I can't help you, I can put you in touch with the author of a particular project, and I'm sure they can. So let's get started. And just a little shout out to my Twitter handle, which I literally never use. I forget that it's a thing, but I hope that you'll use it. So we'll be in this together. So we're going to talk about sleep today. This is our little intro to more aerobic style sleep, but we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of sleep. We'll talk about sleep deprivation, the effects of sleep deprivation, a few sleep disorders. Then we're going to talk about TBI in particular. We'll talk about the short and long-term effects on sleep of traumatic brain injury. Then we'll talk about assessing sleep, intervening to improve sleep, and then field some questions. So this will be kind of a tour through the entire field of sleep. I've included this slide really just to make a point of how much research there is in sleep. If you do a literature search on a library search engine for sleep in any given year, there's about 25,000 articles a year on sleep. And I really found in neuroscience that there's no other area pushing forward faster than research on sleep. And we're going to talk about some of these studies in particular. And you have a copy of this PowerPoint slide. So any of the granular detail that I don't cover, you'll be able to cover. You could read back through the text on your own. And again, if you have questions, you could reach out to me. Essentially, there is an emerging body of research to suggest that sleep is directly related to the development of dementing disease in the brain. So not only, and we've always understood that sleep is critical to brain health, but now we understand better the relationship between poor sleep and disease. So I'm going to show you just a couple of covers. So this from Science. So if you think about the roster, it's like a leaderboard of journals. Science and the Lancet are really at the top. So this was a study from 2019 that summarized the research to suggest that
Kim, I can't hear you.
How's that? Can you guys hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
I swear I didn't even touch anything, but there's no telling. I'll talk so fast, I'm sure the computer will crash on its own. Just in case you didn't hear, so with the previous slide, that Science article suggested that we clear beta amyloid protein when we sleep, and the accumulation of those faulty folded proteins is the pathophysiological signature of Alzheimer's dementia in particular. This is a study from the Lancet that speaks to the relationship between the resolution of inflammation that happens during sleep and dementia disease. So when you shorten sleep, you increase neuroinflammation. And this next is a really interesting article that we're going to talk a little bit more about, because my team and I have published a little bit in this area for the effects of the clearance of these brain health markers, so brain disease markers like phospho-tau, beta amyloid protein in younger adults. So we tend to think of the development of dementing disease and the risk for disease as an older adult problem, but we see that the accumulation of these markers of disease are also characteristic of younger folks who are sleep deprived. So this article in 2020, just very recently in January, found the same phenomena in young athletes, and we'll talk about the research that we've been doing too. So if everybody is hanging in there, seatbelts buckled, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of sleep. And this is as weedy as I get, I promise. So the first thing I want to talk about are sleep stages. So there are 5 stages of sleep. There are 4 non-REM stages of sleep, or NREM stages of sleep, and there's REM sleep. So that's the 5th stage of sleep. The 4 stages of sleep are really aggregated as unique, and we're going to talk about each one of those. And then we talk about REM sleep, or sometimes you hear it referred to as, it's almost like paradoxical sleep, because the brain looks as if it's awake. So we're going to talk about REM sleep separately in just a minute. But the first thing that I want to explain is like a crash course in reading EEG data. EEG data in sleep studies are called polysomnography, or PSG data, but these are just EEG data. And my background at Southern Illinois University, where I did my doctoral degree, we all rotated through Dennis and Victoria Malfesis lab. So we all started doing EEG studies. So this takes me way back, and it's like the basics of brain function. So I'm going to give you the 5-second lecture about the EEG, and you'll have everything you need to know. So EEG data are oscilloscope data. So they're measuring voltage change in cortical tissue. So everybody recognizes an EEG cap. So you have all of these leads, and the voltage change of cortical tissue, depolarization of cortical tissue, is measured in EEG data. So I just want to give you this little snapshot, and then this will make a lot more sense when we talk about sleep stages, the 4 non-REM sleep stages, in just a minute. For an active brain, the EEG data, or oscilloscope readout, is high frequency, low amplitude. So frequency is a measure of the number, and hopefully you guys can also see my cursor. It's the number of waveforms every 5 seconds. So the frequency is the number of waveforms that are packed in, and the amplitude is the waveform height. So wakefulness is characterized by high frequency, low amplitude brain waves. So every one of you, if I had the luxury of looking at your EEG data right now, which who knows, right? A year from now with technology and telehealth, I may be able to do that as I'm presenting to track participant wakefulness. I should see this kind of desynchronous, high frequency, low amplitude brain waves. So as the brain slows, you see slower frequency, higher amplitude waveform. So again, this will make a lot more sense with our next slide, but just making a point to show everyone that these are high frequency, low amplitude waveforms. The highest activity, this would be direct engagement or concentration, are beta waves. So alpha waves are slightly larger waveform, lower frequency than beta waves. So hopefully I see all beta waves. You can see stage 1 sleep starts to slow, lower frequency, higher amplitude. And then as we get into stages 3 and 4 sleep, we see much higher amplitude, lower frequency brain waves. And we're going to talk about what those brain waves are called. And then when we talk about the effects of TBI on sleep, you'll understand better how that works. And again, this is the academic in me that I'm committed to everybody being able to decode this area of research. So that's EEG in a nutshell. If I looked at your EEG, I should see very high frequency, low amplitude. And for those of you who maybe are meditating as we're listening, I may see lower frequency, higher amplitude, or theta waves, for example, which are characteristic of meditative states. So beta and alpha waves characterize wakefulness. Beta theta waves characterize engagement, cognitive engagement, and alpha waves characterize like a relaxed wakeful stage. So for anyone who finds my loud voice particularly soothing, you may have alpha waves. There's also an emerging area of research on gamma waves that I'm not quite sure what to make of yet, so I don't teach about those, but a lot of private EEG firms, so these would be companies that offer Q quantitative EEG surveys, for example, will report on gamma waves, which are the highest frequency, but they're a little bit harder to read because they're masked by interference in the readout. So as those are ready for prime time, I promise to come back and report about gamma waves. But here we're talking about beta and alpha waves. So high frequency, low amplitude waveforms. So now let's talk about sleep. So we've talked about wakefulness. So I'll try to point out all of the life hacks as we go through. So the first life hack is that our sleep cycles are truly wired to 90-minute cycles. So we go through several 90-minute cycles in a night. So somewhere between, let's say, 4 and 6 sleep cycles. So the life hack is to set your alarm for a 90-minute increment from the time that you're falling asleep. So that is the time at which your body is prepared for wakefulness, and it won't. It guarantees that you won't wake feeling kind of sluggish. And I recommend that to all of my students. I do it too, and everybody raves about it. So that's life hack number 1. Stage 1 sleep is characterized by theta waves, and theta waves are slightly lower frequencies, slightly higher amplitude brain waves. I mentioned just a minute ago that theta waves are also characteristic of some meditative states. So there's interesting research on Tibetan monks, for example, looking at EEG data, that they can produce theta waves on demand. So theta is a relaxed brain state. So stage 1 sleep is actually a very small percentage of our total sleep, between 3 and 5% of our total sleep time. And it's a transition from wakefulness to sleep. It should take about 10 minutes. People who fall asleep within 6 minutes. So if let's say your roommate tells you that you start snoring the minute your head hits the pillow, you are sleep deprived. If your partner starts snoring or breathing heavy the minute their head hits the pillow, they are also sleep deprived. So one of the markers of sleep deprivation is stage 1 sleep. So the compression of stage 1 sleep. So we should spend about 10 minutes in stage 1 sleep. Stage 2 sleep is about half to just more than half of our total sleep time. We used to think of stage 2 sleep as like transition sleep. As a matter of fact, it used to be called transition stage. But there's new research to suggest that stage 2 sleep might have everything to do with cognitive function. But I'll just point out 2 pieces of sleep architecture. One is sleep spindles. So these are little short bursts of alpha and beta activity, or high frequency activity, as the brain is slowing. So you see theta waves and then these short little runs of high frequency activity. And that might be when you have a muscle jerk, for example. So as you might be visualizing walking down the sidewalk and you, in your mind, fall off the curb and your body jerks, that's a little sleep spindle. Sleep spindles have been tied now to cognitive function. So it was a coincidence that younger folks have more sleep spindles, older folks have fewer sleep spindles, and that maps onto memory function. So now there's some indication that sleep spindles may be the place where some memory consolidation happens. K complexes are short bursts of super low frequency, high amplitude waveforms, or delta waves. So in stage 2, you have a little bit of wakefulness and a little bit of deep sleep. So the K complexes are, they're only in stage 2 because stage 3 also has delta K complexes have also been associated with motor learning. So there's some really interesting research there. But if you put a pin in the importance of stage 2 sleep, and again, this research has emerged really only over the last 2 years that we've stopped calling stage 2 sleep transition sleep and started to recognize the importance of it, largely because of the research on the post-injury recovery of cognitive function and mapping that onto changes in sleep architecture. Stage 3 and 4 sleep are called slow wave sleep. So that means that they have high amplitude, low frequency, or delta wave forms. So stage 3 sleep is the point at which you hit 20 to 50, less than half of the waveforms are delta waves. And then stage 4 sleep is the point at which more than half of the waveforms are delta waves. And let me just go back quickly to point out now that you all have an understanding. So you can see theta activity here, so lower frequency, slightly higher waveform. Stage 2 sleep, little runs of high frequency activity that look like wakefulness, and little runs of slow wave sleep or delta waves, so these K complexes. Stage 3 sleep, the point at which you surpass 20% but are below 50% of waveforms are slow waves or delta waves. And then stage 4 sleep is more than half the waveforms are slow wave sleep. And then we're going to talk about the purposes of the different kinds of sleep, which is really interesting. If you are awakened during slow wave sleep, you can imagine that it's like an idling engine, so idling at its lowest speed. So in slow wave sleep, the oxygen metabolism would suggest that the brain is actually resting. So a lot of things happen during slow wave sleep, and we're going to talk about that. But if your alarm goes off during slow wave sleep, imagine that it's like getting a car up to speed from a really slow idle. So you're kind of fuzzy and disoriented. The reason people talk about not waking sleepwalkers, for example, is because sleepwalking, somnambulism, is a slow wave sleep disorder. So there's no danger to waking a sleepwalker, but the risk is that you're waking them from slow wave sleep. And in their mind, they remember going to bed in their bed, and you're waking them in a totally novel environment or new surroundings, and it's really disorienting and scary. So that's the reason people say don't wake a sleepwalker, but just direct them back to their bed. Here's a picture of when we talk about sleep architecture. This is a picture of sleep architecture. So again, the sleep cycles are 90 minutes long. So remember the life hack number 1, that you should set your alarm in 90-minute increments. So 8 hours of sleep is not a thing, but 7.5 or 9 hours of sleep is a thing. You should like live by this new motto. And some of you may already know that. So this is a picture of EEG stages. So W is wakefulness. You can see, right, you spend a little bit of time as you're relaxing. This is usually sleep hygiene. We'll talk more about that. Stage 1 sleep, stage 2 sleep, stage 3 and 4. And then you can see the brain accelerates into REM sleep and then goes back down through the stages again. What you notice as you look at the overall image is that slow wave sleep is front loaded at nighttime or during the daytime for shift workers, and REM sleep is backloaded. So there's proportionately more REM sleep as the night goes on, proportionally more slow wave sleep early in the night. So if you don't sleep long or you wake too early, so we talk about different kinds of insomnias, but one of them is people who wake too early and can't fall back asleep. They lose all of that REM sleep for the second half of the sleep cycle, for example. Quick little note about slow wave sleep. So a lot of the sleep research, the gold standard in research, has been to look at slow wave sleep and to look at the function of REM sleep. I mentioned that we've only just recently started to look at stage 2 sleep as having any importance. So slow wave sleep is important for all kinds of reasons. It's not just adaptive. There was a period of time where we thought slow wave sleep was a function of safety, that from an evolutionary perspective, it made sense for us to almost have a quasi hibernation when it's dark, because it's not safe for people to be outside in the dark this millennia ago. But you see slow wave sleep in all mammals, and mammals that have to swim, like dolphins, they'll have slow wave sleep in alternating hemispheres of the brain, or for 60-second bouts of time. So every mammal has slow wave sleep. And cognitive research suggests that in slow wave sleep, memory is consolidated. So if you think about slow wave sleep, it comes after new learning. So if you've spent the day studying for a test, during slow wave sleep that night, you will consolidate the information that you have committed to memory and then perform better on the test the next day. The other function of slow wave sleep is to prune the other connections. And we'll talk a little bit more about how REM sleep also contributes to that. So part of learning includes unlearning. So you have to prune connections you're not using to reinforce new connections, new learning. And then here's a picture of a dolphin brain. This is a dolphin brain slow wave sleep. So those are the 4 stages of non-REM sleep. Now let's talk about REM sleep. So REM sleep is dreaming. It's a dream state. It's characterized by an increase in EEG activity. So it looks a lot like wakefulness. You see alpha and beta activity during REM sleep. What's really interesting, though, is that we have total distal muscle paralysis. So you have no movement at all during REM sleep. But if we were to look at your brain in, let's say, a SPECT scan, we were looking at areas of activation in the brain, your brain would look as if you're doing whatever it is you're dreaming about. So flying, walking, running, falling, touching something, tasting something, looking at something, all of those things activate the parts of the brain that they do during wakeful state, only you're paralyzed at night. So, and then some people have a condition called REM without atonia, where their muscles aren't paralyzed, and then they can't sleep with other people because they inadvertently beat them up or kick them out of bed at night. We call REM sleep paradoxical sleep because, again, it looks like wakefulness on EEG, and we spend somewhere as adults, somewhere between 10 and 25% of our total sleep time. So in all of those sleep cycles in a night, we spend between 4 and 5 periods of time in REM sleep. Again, remember that those are backloaded so that they come, the periods of REM sleep occur later in the night. So you can see you spend proportionally more and more time in REM sleep as the night goes on. REM sleep and slow wave sleep have a really curious rebound effect. So if you were sleep deprived, you wouldn't suddenly go to bed and then sleep for, well, I'm so tired, I'm gonna sleep for 30 hours straight. That doesn't happen. And we'll talk about the world record for sleep deprivation. But what does happen is you spend proportionately more time in slow wave sleep and REM sleep. So there is some kind of mechanism that governs how much slow wave sleep and REM sleep you get. REM sleep is tied more directly to learning. Infants, for example, spend almost all, so 70+% of their time in sleep in REM sleep, and older adults spend much less time in REM sleep. So it drops below 15%. Again, for most of us, we should be at about, I would say 15 to 25% of our time is REM sleep. It's not clear whether REM sleep makes it possible to learn, let's say REM sleep last night makes it possible for you to learn things today, or whether, like slow wave sleep, REM sleep helps to consolidate information from what you've learned today. So if REM sleep, your dream state tonight, will facilitate your recall of the information from this presentation. So you do see a proportionate increase in REM sleep after new learning. So for example, studies on kids studying for the SAT finds that they spend more time in REM sleep ahead of the test as they're learning new things. Okay. The last little piece of sleep mechanics that I wanted to mention, because it's important as we talk about TBI and sleep, is circadian rhythms. So part of our the mechanism that governs our sleepiness and wakefulness during the day is melatonin. And melatonin is a compound produced by the pineal gland. And here we're talking about endogenous melatonin, so the melatonin we produce, not that you might supplement. Melatonin produced by the pineal glands, and we produce melatonin when it's dark out. So melatonin in the wintertime makes you feel more sleepy and sluggish, and some folks have an especially hard problem with that and may have seasonal affective disorder, but we produce melatonin in the dark. And melatonin is synthesized from the metabolites of dairy products, for example. So the old wives' tale about a glass of warm milk to help you sleep actually promotes the production of melatonin. So in that way, like is true with a lot of those old tales, there's actually some physiological basis to that. So it's important to remember also the function of melatonin. So let's talk about what happens when you don't get enough sleep. The unofficial world record for sleep deprivation is 264 hours. It's unofficial because the Guinness Book of World Records doesn't condone record setting for any activity that is dangerous or life-threatening. So there's no world record for holding your breath, for example. So this is an unofficial world record. And what's really interesting is after that person, this was a young man, stayed awake for 264 hours, he slept for 10 hours. So that tells you something about the rebound effect. It isn't that he slept for a week straight, like you might think. He slept for just a short period of time and would have spent more time in slow wave sleep and REM sleep. When I say next that there's no consistent physical and physiological consequences of sleep loss, I mean that there isn't a universal effect that is true for all people. There are universally negative effects for all people, but each person will have a unique constellation of these negative effects. So I'll make a point to just say sleep deprivation research in the lab means inviting participants to go to bed 1 to 2 hours later for 3 days in a row. So that's the experimental condition for sleep loss. So I teach graduate students and I tell them about this research, and this is their best case scenario, to lose only 1 or 2 hours of sleep for 3 nights in a row. So they've lost a lot more sleep than that. For a lot of you working long shifts, for a lot of you who now are working from home, so your workday extends much longer than it did when you were in an office, you look like the experimental control group for the sleep deprivation research. So bear that in mind. Increasing levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is related to all kinds of wear and tear on the body. Decreased production of growth hormone. Importantly, we produce growth hormone during slow wave sleep. Decreased immune system function, so your risk for picking up COVID-19 is much greater if you're sleep deprived. Your risk of taking longer to recover from any illness when you're sleep deprived is much greater. People gain weight, their metabolism slows, they deposit fat more readily because the body interprets that as an alarm state. People self-report more negative mood, and the cognitive consequences are huge. One of the areas of study that's really interesting has been pioneered by NHTSA, or the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, about microsleep. And their point, and this led to changes in the way over-the-road truck drivers need to now log 8 hours off the road, was that these microsleeps were causing automobile fatalities every year to the tune of, and they track more than 2,000 fatalities, more than 100,000 accidents, and these are just where the driver reported being sleepy. And if you've ever watched, there's a million YouTube videos about how people who are sleep deprived, reaction time slows way down, and they look like they're drunk and they look impaired, and you can imagine them behind the wheel. And I'll just show you a picture of what microsleep looks like. So here's what you look like when you're awake. Here are those delta waves when you're asleep. And here's microsleep. So an important reminder. This is like an adage that's true about the brain and is reassuring for people with insomnia. It will take the sleep it needs. The problem is that it may take that sleep during a period of time where you need to be awake, like if you're driving in a car or you're teaching a webinar, for example. And again, I mentioned this earlier, if you fall asleep in less than 6 minutes, that's the clinical definition of sleep deprivation. So this, I'm sure, applies to a lot of you. I've included this. It's from Huffington Post several years ago, but what I love is that it's a great infographic to share with your clients. So because it makes in one image all of the points that we've talked about the risks of sleep loss. So let's talk briefly about formal sleep disorders. We sleep less than previous generations. A lot of us, 1 in 5 Americans, work shift work, which is especially damaging for sleep architecture. So you think, well, it's no problem. I'm awake at night and I sleep during the day, but the quality of this sleep during the day for people who work shift work is much less, and they erode life expectancy in some research by as much as 10 to 15 years. So 40% of adults report that they've fallen asleep during the day at least once without meaning to. Insomnia is fairly ubiquitous, but diagnosed insomnia affects about a quarter of people, occasionally 9% of people regularly. And I wanted to make a quick little sidebar comment about sleep apnea. And this will come up again when we talk about traumatic brain injury, but sleep apnea is the most common and most traditionally underdiagnosed, unrecognized sleep disorder out there, like period, end of story. If you snore, you should be evaluated for sleep apnea. And I say that as someone who does snore. So, and we kind of joke about like, well, yeah, I snore really loud. We're not supposed, as it turns out, you're not supposed to snore. So sleep apnea is, we think of it as a condition where you don't have enough oxygen, but sleep apnea actually messes with the primary respiratory drive, which is carbon dioxide. So sleep apnea is a condition in which you fail to blow off enough carbon dioxide. So what you see then, and then sleep apnea can be caused by genetics, that you have a naturally soft palate. You see an increased risk for sleep apnea in people who have more adipose tissue. You see a much higher increased risk for sleep apnea after TBI. So the effects of sleep apnea, from risk for cardiovascular disease and blood pressure disorders to risk for stroke, large cognitive consequences, huge mood consequences. It really cannot be overstated how important it is to screen and have a conversation about sleep apnea. Here's a picture of the sleep architecture of someone with sleep apnea. So if you can imagine that as muscles relax, that soft palate relaxes and impedes the exhalation of carbon dioxide. And that's the primary respiratory drive. So as the accumulation of carbon dioxide turns the blood slightly acidotic, it triggers this emergency respiratory drive, which is the big gasp that people describe in sleeping with someone who has sleep apnea. So what you see in the sleep architecture is, just as they're relaxing and the soft palate relaxes, they're awakened by this huge gasp. So you can see that all night, and it significantly erodes the quality of sleep. Snoring, especially in kids, has been linked to all manner of cognitive and behavioral problems. I've shared some of this research here, but this even in kids as young as 6 months old, and you hear infants snore and you think, oh my gosh, that's so cute. I listen to little kids snore, my own son snore, and I think, it's cute, but that's a problem. So we should be attending to reports from our clients that they snore, or a report from their partner that they snore, because it means they should be evaluated. The last point I want to make about sleep loss is that the consequences are huge. This from the NBA, Tobias Harris. He's actually been a media spokesperson to suggest that for professional athletes, the biggest health cost for them is sleep deprivation. And he talks about it on the scale of the kind of problem that the NFL has with concussions and their relationship to longer-term dementing disease. So Tobias Harris has made the case that sleep loss for professional athletes starts the same risk for longer-term dementing disease and will be addressed in that way. So just something to think about. So now let's talk about what happens after traumatic brain injury. So sleep is everything for healthy brain function. After injury, sleep disturbance is almost ubiquitous. So almost 80% of people have disrupted sleep after even a mild injury. And this slide really just summarizes some of the problems. So sleep is everything for neural recovery. So it's all about rebuilding pathways. It's also everything for participation in rehabilitation. It's everything for determining a longer-term outcome. So cognitive function, emotional function, adaptive function, employment outcomes. What you see is that there is a particular cost in sustained attention and short-term memory. So these are two of the more fragile and easily disrupted cognitive domains after injury. And what's true is that, especially without treatment, that those sleep disruptions can be permanent even after mild injury. So again, this highlights the importance of the kind of work that you guys are doing. The kinds of sleep disorders that people report after traumatic brain injury, it's everything. It's insomnia, it's polysomnia, which is sleeping too much, excessive daytime sleepiness. So this is where their participation in their day-to-day activities is eroded because they feel so exhausted all day, and things like sleep apnea. This 2012 meta-analysis broke down all of the data to that point and categorized a third of patients with insomnia, 25, a quarter of them with new onset sleep apnea, 28% were sleeping too much, 4% had new onset narcolepsy. And what's really interesting is the way that sleep disturbance is emerging as a really important variable also in VA and Department of Defense research. And some of my VA DoD colleagues may be on this call, and I tip my hat to you on this research because it's really remarkable. Sleep is emerging as the variable that accounts for the vulnerability for the development of poor outcomes in PTSD after exposure to trauma and brain injury. So it also mediates the effect of the development of depression. And really interestingly, this polytrauma clinical triad, which everybody is familiar with this research. So this is traumatic stress disorder, TBI, and chronic pain, which is associated with the highest risk of suicidality. What researchers have identified is that if you add sleep disturbance to the mix, that accounts for the highest suicide risk. So there is a tremendous pressure on folks working in VAs and DoDs to do sleep-related interventions because it elevates suicide risk in the most vulnerable populations. So now let's go back to sleep architecture, because you were like, why the heck did we learn all about that nonsense with EEG data? It's really because I wanted you to understand what's different after TBI, and there's different stages. So there's a lot of data on sleep architecture during inpatient stays, which we know, with the lights are on and people are in and out to take vitals, that sleep is really easily disrupted in those settings. Then you have short term, so this 0 to 6 month window, and then you have long term, so this like 6 to 12 plus month window. So what's obviously true for people in inpatient settings after traumatic brain injury is that they don't sleep long enough. Surprise, surprise. They have poor sleep efficiency, so their architecture gets eroded, and they don't spend a lot of time in REM sleep. So if you think about REM sleep being important for cognitive function and learning, everything about sleep erodes the capacity to benefit from inpatient rehabilitation. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, the accessibility to rehab and the downsides of rehab settings at nighttime. The short-term consequences for brain injury to sleep architecture are that people spend more time in slow wave sleep, which is really important. So slow wave sleep is, remember, we secrete growth hormone during slow wave sleep, and it's presumed that slow wave sleep is when neural recovery happens. So slow wave sleep is actually a great marker of neural recovery. So in the short term, spending more time in slow wave sleep is actually a really good thing. Less time in stage 2. Remember that we just talked about how important stage 2 is for memory consolidation. So that might account for the failure in attention and short-term memory, for example, in the short term after brain injury, and reduce sleep efficiency. So the architecture the structure of sleep architecture gets eroded over time. But importantly, slow increase in slow wave sleep accounts for the recovery we see, especially in that first 6 months after brain injury. The cost to stage 2 sleep might account for the persistence of especially deficits in attention, processing speed, short-term memory. There are a lot of other studies to suggest that stage 2 sleep stays impaired, especially in the short term. So again, that relationship with cognition. And interestingly, the long-term effects on sleep architecture for traumatic brain injury include people spend more time proportionately in stage 1 and stage 2 sleep. Stage 1 is really, like we used to call stage 2 sleep, transition sleep, but stage 1 really is transition sleep. So there's really no physiological benefit to it, but you see much less REM sleep over time. So there's slow wave sleep, normals levels back out, and then stage 1, stage 2 sleep, more of it. So this can be a product of increased attention to rehabilitation, for example. And it is impeded in some ways by less REM sleep. So we're not talking today about interventions to promote dreaming or to track dreams, but that may be an option too that's like outside of the traditional boxes. So the long-term risks for people with brain injury, this is a study, and you can see I've been like a complete megalomaniac with my name there. This is a research team that I've been really excited to be part of. This is a biomarker research team. So we're looking at concussive injuries, so concussion biomarker research team that includes researchers here at the University of Denver and then researchers also at the Karolinska Institute, so Ed Getzel. In our research, so this with college athletes, we found that the same thing where self-reported sleep disruption was related to the persistence of increased levels of disease biomarkers. So it may be that disrupted sleep is the mediator, because we haven't found a lot of causal links between brain injury, subconcussive or repeated concussive injuries, and long-term disease outcomes, dementing disease outcomes in particular. So it may be that disrupted sleep is the mediator. So if you can fix sleep after even mild brain injury, you may prevent a whole host of longer-term poor outcomes. Why and how does sleep get completely obliterated by brain injury? Some people are terrible sleepers before they were injured. So if you were a terrible sleeper before your injury, the likelihood that that sleep disorder gets exaggerated is huge. And then there's this complex relationship between physiology and environment. There's a lot of metabolic changes in the brain that account also for changes in the production of melatonin, for example. So circadian rhythms get kind of wonky. I have a picture of a Doberman here because there's a really interesting body of research for that small percentage of people who develop narcolepsy. So narcolepsy is presumed now to be an autoimmune disorder where the body attacks. It's a compound called hypocretin that promotes wakefulness. So for people after brain injury, one of the signature, this as a pathophysiological change, is the decreased production of hypocretin. So that's the chemical that maintains wakefulness. So in people with narcolepsy, you know that they have these sleep attacks where they essentially run out of hypocretin. So it looks a lot like that in brain injury too. And for some small percentage of them, they're diagnosed with narcolepsy. But for the rest of them, you see that same thing with their energy during the day, and we'll talk more about that. So how do you assess sleep problems with your patients or clients who have brain injury and you have reason to think about sleep disturbance? Here's my little sidebar about that. You should have reason with every single one of your clients. So I tell my students that even in outpatient clinical practice, not specific to brain injury or neuropsychology, that they should be asking about sleep in every single intake. So I think you should embed it as part of your standard interview process. But in terms of the assessment, the first thing you need to do in any assessment is to identify the presence of the kinds of rule outs. So, you know, the physiological rule out, someone with dementing disease or who is acutely delirious is not going to benefit as well from your sleep hygiene intervention techniques. They need also medical intervention. So none of these rule outs mean that your interventions are ineffective. It means that you also need another team member to address the other medical problems. So someone with GERD, for example, will need to take some kind of acid blocker so that they can lay in a bed comfortably at night. So some people can't lay in a supine position because acid reflux. This is my favorite instrument. It's really quick and easy. It's 19 items. It's available for free. Apologies that the link is so long. It's like I wish it had a more sensible URL, but I can also send you the PowerPoint so that the hyperlinks are active. I'm not sure that they're active in the PDF that you have, but it's a very brief self-report instrument. It's 19 items. Essentially, it just gives you a really narrative clinical feel for the perception of disrupted sleep. There's also an additional 5 items that you can administer to someone's partner if they happen to sleep with someone at night. It's a lot like ADHD instruments where the perspective of outsiders can be really useful. If someone thinks like, well, I sleep fine, I just wake up feeling really tired. We shouldn't wake up feeling really tired. So if you wake up after 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep feeling really tired, it means that you have less sleep efficiency. So that's especially characteristic of people with TBI. So an instrument like this is helpful because you can then track changes over time. So you can get baseline data, this PSG, you can get baseline PSG data and then track it at 1 month intervals as you're working with someone. If you don't have an instrument like that, this BEARS questionnaire is a really good thing to just add to a standard verbal clinical interview or intake interview, because this just gives you an idea, very roughly speaking, of what someone may be experiencing. A sleep diary can also be really helpful depending on how much detail you want to get about how they're sleeping. And this, again, is a tool that you can use over time. You could assign this if you see someone on a weekly basis, let's say, or monthly basis, you could ask them to keep this the whole time. So what are the interventions for the kinds of sleep disorders we've talked about after TBI? Depending on what category that sleep disorder falls into, it dictates the intervention. So if, for example, you have a wonder, you're curious about sleep apnea because their partner talks about them gasping in the night or waking frequently, maybe a roommate says that they snore really loud. If their complaint is, I go to bed right away, I fall asleep right away, but I wake up feeling really tired, you might also think about sleep apnea. So now they have home sleep apnea tests. It used to be that you had to go to a sleep lab, and nobody liked that because it was weird and intrusive and hard to fall asleep with a lab tech watching you essentially, and you're all wired up. But now you can do those kinds of tests at home, and a lot of insurers will pay for it because the consequences of sleep apnea are so much more costly. So insurers will cover sleep apnea assessment and treatment. The Gold standard is a CPAP. So there's a lot of behavioral health intervention around CPAP compliance. But there's a lot of other newer interventions because CPAPs are a pain in the butt and they're clunky and big, and the compliance rate is statistically speaking like 7%. So anyway, there's a lot of research that you could do. You could help clients to research the best option for them, or the options that are covered by a payer, for example, or that fit with their budget. So sleep apnea has a whole different set of interventions that you will support in different ways. But for anyone whose complaint is, I have a hard time falling asleep, I have a hard time staying asleep, or I feel I sleep for 10 hours a night and then I feel sleepy in the afternoon, you can use any one of these interventions. The gold standard is sleep hygiene. And this is the gold standard above and beyond, way above and beyond any kind of pharmacological intervention. And sleep hygiene, this is all the relatively, it seems like a pain in the butt, and everyone knows this stuff, but we don't do it. It's going to bed and waking up at the same time every day. It's having the same bedtime routine so that you start to slow, right? You can start to produce theta waves as you're brushing your teeth and washing your face, or putting your pajamas on, or hanging up your clothes before you get into bed. It's whatever it might be. So here is one example of a sleep hygiene handout, but it works if you stick to it. So the efficacy of sleep hygiene interventions is amazing. Another intervention for someone especially who says, you know, I just have a hard time falling asleep at night, I have a hard time shutting my brain off, is progressive muscle relaxation. So giving them the tools to walk through their body, usually head to toe, to clench and then release major muscle groups, so that they can focus that cognitive attention on something other than ruminating about the day or the next day. And instead, right now they have a script. You might even record it for them so that they listen to it on an iPhone at night as they go to bed. So this is a great way to shortcut the path to sleep for someone who has a hard time falling asleep. And CBTI is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is the gold standard. One of my favorite new inventions is these kinds of mobile apps. The VA released this one. It's totally free. It's for consumer use. There's also a professional app, but you guys, if the first stop you make after this webinar is done is to download this app, then I have done you a tremendous service. Whoops. So this is the flyer for the CBTI handout, but any psychotherapist is who does CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, might offer CBTI, which is just a way of adding sleep hygiene to the mix. So that is a terrific benefit. Blue light therapy. Jenny Ponsford, our colleague in Australia, has done a lot of this research. More recently, there is an explosion of research on blue light therapy. Blue light therapy is exposure to blue light for 30 minutes in the morning. And especially post TBI, the research suggests that promotes wakefulness for the day, and it promotes sleepiness at nighttime. So melatonin production is suppressed by blue light, which is why we're not supposed to have blue light like our iPhone device in bed with us at night, because we're suppressing melatonin production. But blue light therapy at the right time can actually be really helpful. So I've directed you to some of those resources. This is what a blue light box. It's also a walk outside in the sunshine. So, or to be outside in the sunshine in the morning. Limiting technology. This is a great resource from our colleagues in Pennsylvania. So how do you, well, I have to check my emails at night. That's just part of what I do. So here are a bunch of suggestions on how to limit technology at night. And then finally, strategic napping. So all of these data are for folks without traumatic brain injury. So the benefits of naps are amazing. If you have either primary insomnia, so trouble falling asleep at night, or post-injury, then you need to be really strategic about napping. So that means less than 20-minute nap one time a day. And you can work a lot with clients to carry a yoga mat. And how do you talk to an employer about carving out a space for napping for 20 minutes during a lunch break or a morning break? So a lot of you know that working with folks post-injury, it's not a question of taking a nap. It's just a question of like an off switch. So they don't have the luxury of feeling like they could nap later. And then melatonin, if this is a fit, and I would have this conversation with physicians, but if you talk to neuroscientists about, well, what is it that you take? To a person, they'll all take melatonin. There's no indication that the pineal gland stops producing melatonin, and it has tremendous antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties. So that is a great addition to the roster. And who don't produce enough, whose production of melatonin is suppressed after injury, it can be a great homeopathic remedy. Also, I've blown through questions. I've ended on the nose. I'm so grateful for you guys to have hung in the whole time. If I can be helpful or answer any other questions, you can tell I love to talk about this stuff. So please reach out, watch the literature. It's the coolest area to see evolve in real time. And thank you, NASHIA.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorgon. I know that it's about 1 o'clock right now. We do want to take the opportunity to answer, 2 or 3 questions, and then the rest of the questions, what we'll do is turn them over to you so that we can email the participants after.
Okay, so here's one question. Does insomnia have a genetic component?
Excellent. I don't know about that research, but I'm guessing that if there is a heritable component, it is complicated in large part by nurture. So we learn our sleep hygiene patterns from our families, right? We learn about what it looks like to get ready for bed, when to go to bed, how tired it is normal to feel during the day. We've normalized now feeling tired all day, so that's a real problem. So I'm not familiar with research on the heritability of insomnia. There's heritability for certain diseases like fatal familial insomnia, which is a super rare disorder. But I would guess that it's exaggerated and complicated by family habits.
Cool. Second question, what should be the ideal and optimum sleep-wake cycle in terms of hours during the day and night?
Excellent. So you'll meet people who are like, I need only 4 hours of sleep. And sleep is like a bell curve, like anything else. And you're going to meet these really vocal outliers. Some people are like, no, I function best on 10.5 hours of sleep, and maybe that actually works for them. There is research for older adults that says that 10+ hours of sleep actually is related to increased stroke risk. So really that window in the middle of the bell curve is 7.5 or 9 hours. And we say 7.5 to 9 because sometimes it takes people longer to fall asleep. So if it takes you a half hour to fall asleep, then, right, it may look like 8 hours, but it's really 7.5 hours of sleep. For anyone who doesn't have primary insomnia, so that means you don't have trouble falling asleep at night and isn't recovering from a brain injury, naps are a real luxury. A 90-minute nap is an entire sleep cycle, and there's a tremendous cognitive benefit to it. One of the handouts that you have there talks about the benefits of different length naps. Selfishly, I was so happy to see research finally validate longer naps, because this research on like the 10-minute nap I thought was so absurd. It seems hideous to me to nap for 10 minutes, but we all wish for the kind of lifestyle where we could nap, but there's a tremendous health and cognitive benefit to napping. For people who have a hard time falling asleep at night, you have to be really judicious about napping because it knocks off a little sleep pressure that we accumulate during the day. And setting an alarm for 20 minutes is really key. And the same for someone with a brain injury, because you're really trying to get their circadian rhythm back to a standard sleep-wake cycle where they have 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep at nighttime.
Okay, last question, and there are many questions that we will get answers for you for later. Any recommendations for getting families and especially teens on board with sleep hygiene practices?
Yeah, this is such a huge question with teenagers. So TBI notwithstanding, uh, you have seen a tremendous push in policy to start school days later because the circadian rhythms of teenagers are different than they are for adults. So for teenagers, and our circadian rhythm is just changes in body temperature, which regulates sleep-wake cycle and the production of melatonin when it's dark out. So the body temperatures of teenagers don't lower at the same pace that they do for older adults and for much younger kids. So that means that the actual true sleep cycle, the point at which someone feels sleepy and then has, let's say, 5 or 6 sleep cycles, 5 or 6 90-minute sleep cycles, is totally eroded by having to wake up at 6 a.m. to be at school to start a day by 7:45, let's say. So the cost to waking up early is that you're taking off a lot of that REM sleep, which is prerequisite for learning, which is the principal demand for kids. It is a huge social problem. And so now more and more school districts are starting high schools later and later based on this kind of science that says, like, we're not getting anywhere with teenagers because we're starting too early and they naturally don't feel sleepy until later than the rest of their families. I have found with my own teenager to really highlight the importance of sleep for cognition has been the hook, right? That school feels much harder when you're sleep deprived or you don't go to bed until later. And you try to shift their circadian rhythms as much as possible. So they shouldn't exercise after dinner, for example. So you don't want more or higher body temperature. They shouldn't drink caffeine after probably 2 p.m. I think it's like traditionally noon. That includes things like chocolate that have caffeine in it. So the more you can do with teenagers to improve the likelihood that they can get to sleep at night, and some of them have worries because we're overtaxing them with lots of responsibilities. So those kinds of CBT interventions like progressive muscle relaxation can be really helpful. The other big piece with teenagers and the technology handout that I shared is actually designed for adolescents. So what you hear from a lot of teenagers is that they fall asleep with their phone or while watching a movie on their laptop in bed. And that blue light is actually suppressing the production of melatonin, which is the very compound that would make them feel sleepy. So in sleep hygiene model, explaining how that is counterproductive and that the cost is they're going to be shorter, they're going to have less muscle mass, they're going to have a harder time feeling healthy and concentrating in school. There's a hook in there for each kid somewhere, but it's a lot of work on the part of family members to structure the environment so that you can optimize that for them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorgen. There's still more questions coming in, and like we said, we are going to follow up with you all and email you all the answers.
Gabby, awesome. Happy to do that.
All right. So if you enjoyed today's event, please stay tuned for announcements. We have more webinars coming up in the calendar of 2020. Part 2 of our wellness series will be on July 15th. And of course, save the date for NASHIA's State of the States Conference this September. This year, the event will be virtual to ensure everyone's health and well-being while still providing you with outstanding content. Details about registration and sponsorship opportunities can be found on our website. Thank you for viewing this webinar. Please contact us to receive notice of future events and other resources. Our archived webinars are available online, and we would love to have you as a member. So please visit us at www.nashia.org. And don't forget to complete your evaluation at the end of this webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.